sound? What is that strange sound? Ooh. Where can it be coming from?
Hello and welcome to Strange Sound. This is episode 18 of Strange Sound. I'm Joe. Thanks for joining me. Here we are in yet another exciting week of the COVID crisis and simultaneous crisis in American policing and governance. In other words, the ongoing dumpster fire of the Trump era, the year 2020 turning out to be all that it's been promised, the worst year ever for a lot of people. Collectively, I think this may be, this is well on the way to being the worst year ever. So give credit where credit is due. This year sucks. We all know it. It's been quite a week. Yeah, another amazing week in the life of America. And just yesterday, I'm recording this on July 4th, Independence Day. Just yesterday, the president did a big rally in front of Mount Rushmore, and there were flyovers and fireworks, and he gave his usual sort of Steve Miller crap speech that he gave, full of all kinds of dark inferences about anarchists and socialists and, people trying to tear down our heritage and our traditions and all this real toxic stuff. He's playing the Nixon 1968 card, somewhat strangely forgetting that Nixon was not president in 1968 when he was playing that card. And I don't think it works as well if you're an incumbent, because if you're describing a dysfunctional America that you think is going way wrong, well, you are president of the United States. So what does that say about you? So you're kind of making the argument for removing yourself from office. But, I mean, you don't want to read too much into these speeches because it was probably written by Stephen Miller, and he is, without a doubt, the worst speech writer ever to reach his position in life, ever to write for a president, at least in living memory. I've heard a lot of presidential speeches in my life. And he is the worst ever. I say this as someone who writes speeches for a living, part of my living. And I do not consider myself a skilled enough writer to write a speech for a president of the United States. Even this one. But I will say that just from my own perspective as someone who writes for a living, Stephen Miller is a terrible writer. He's just terrible. And it just amazes me that he has risen to the level that he's risen to. I mean, that's just that's a little hobby horse of mine. Completely beside the point of the actual event itself, which was obscene. Once again, finding a locus of atrocity and of particular significance to the extermination of and the marginalization of indigenous people, just as choosing Tulsa was a way of saying to black people, you belong in your place. We're going to go there on Juneteenth and around the anniversary of the worst, basically white on black rioting, killing pogrom that took place. I think it was 1919, was it, in Tulsa? Someone will correct me. Forgive me if I got that wrong. Pretty awful. Tulsa riot. And, the Black Hills, where they carved Mount Rushmore carved by a racist. Carved by a Klan sympathizer. And, depictions of the slave owner, George Washington, village destroyer, as we know, up here in upstate New York. Village destroyer, George Washington, slave owner, Thomas Jefferson, and actually kind of the author of the indigenous removal policies that were later carried out by people like Andrew Jackson. Certainly envisioned an America, a yeoman farmer republic that would be made way for by pushing Native Americans off of their land, and which was particularly followed through with later on, and which was part of the impetus for the Louisiana Purchase. You can hear a lot more about this elsewhere. I am not an expert on this subject. I'm just sharing what little bits I've gleaned from other people's expertise. So, anyway, Trump is expert at, I guess the idea is just triggering people, just pissing people off, and just getting his base to be sort of energized. For them right now, in the current status of his reelection campaign, I think they feel like this defense of Confederate and sort of historic statues is like a strong point for them, that's a winner for them in some way, because, I don't know, they probably got some polling that says people don't want to see statues pulled down or whatever, and that they're going to use that as a sort of cultural talisman that will help carry them over the finish line this November. I think they're badly miscalculating there, but we'll see. But that's obviously the reason why he chose Mount Rushmore as a locus for his July 3rd speech, his July 4th weekend big extravaganza of a speech. And it's pretty disgusting. And it's pretty typical. It's basically, I'm not going to say a dog whistle, it's more like a foghorn to all the white supremacists out there, to foghorn leghorn, as it were. Here I am, Trump. Return me to office for another 4 years, and I'll see to it that you get everything you want. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. Anyway, that wasn't really what I was going to talk about this week. Fact is, this week I was going to talk about me. That's right, me. This week I was going to talk about Joe. And what am I going to talk about with regard to me? Well, I wanted to talk about, in past episodes, I've talked about a little bit about the current policing crisis and race in America to a limited extent. Again, I'm not an expert. I'm just an observer. And I think I mentioned in my first episode that, yes, I am a white cisgender male. Grew up in relatively privileged circumstances, middle class, sort of upper working class, middle class, something like that. I'm not sure how you describe it. In America, it's not very well defined, right? Everybody thinks they're middle class. That's what my parents thought they were when they were young. But I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what my experience has been and how that differs from what the experience of people of color is in the United States. I think this is pretty obvious, but I just wanted to use this as an example because it's something that I'm keenly aware of, and it's something that I think is true of, it's true of a broad spectrum of people in the United States. A lot of white people have had this experience, right? This type of experience. My parents were from a kind of a working class background. My dad had an equivalency diploma, never graduated high school. He just earned his equivalency after World War II and started working just in more or less manual labor jobs and moved into sales jobs, that sort of thing. We only ever really had one worker in the family in the traditional sense of, someone going out and being the breadwinner, as they used to say. And that was my dad. He basically worked one job for maybe 35 years. Moved around a little bit before that. But during the years of my parents' marriage, they had 5 children. I was number 4. 5 children between the years of, between the late 40s and the early 60s, let's say. So it was an entire group of children within the broad scope of the baby boom. Sort of every stage of the baby boom every base of it was covered by the 5 of us. And, we grew up in that sort of typical post-war white suburban family situation where dad got up every morning and went out to work, and his salary paid for the house that we lived in, which was, had a mortgage on it. And we went to public schools. And they were sort of suburban public schools. I mean, I spent the first few years of my life living in Utica, but it was North Utica, so it was kind of a suburban area. I went to one of the city schools, but it was more like a suburban school than it was like an inner city school. North Utica is and was back then basically a suburb of the city. So went there. Then my parents moved to New Hartford, which is, as I've described before, a rock-ribbed Republican town, or at least was back then. They moved there mostly because of my mother's. My mother was having some respiratory problems in North Utica. The air was really bad because it was kind of close to the city dump. They used to burn a lot of garbage back in those days, and there was also a greenhouse that had a smokestack that was not within spitting distance, but within a mile of our house, and the prevailing winds were such that my mother was having really bad problems. I remember her wearing a face mask back when I was probably 5-6 years old. So we moved up onto a hill in New Hartford. Again, New Hartford is the town where Representative Claudia Tenney grew up. I went to high school with her briefly, as I've mentioned previously. By the way, she is running for Congress once again. So if anyone doesn't remember Claudia Tenney's tenure during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, just Google Claudia Tenney, and you'll find some very interesting stuff. She is running against our current representative, Anthony Brindisi. So it's a rematch. Anyway, we moved to New Hartford. What was my life like? It was the typical, white suburban life, right? I mean, I went from a poorly resourced school a relatively poorly resourced school in the city of Utica, a school that no longer exists. It was called Horatio Seymour School, elementary school in North Utica. It was poorly resourced in the sense that they didn't have a lot of money to work with. I mean, I remember the lunchroom being basically bare. You could buy subsidized milk for like 2 cents and a carton of milk at lunchtime, and everybody brought their lunch. They didn't serve lunch, right? When we moved to New Hartford, I was in the 3rd grade. It was kind of astonishing to me because, I mean, this was, a whiter town than the one that I was used to, and people had more money, but there was a subsidized lunch program. I mean, for 30 cents, you could have a hot lunch every day. There were buses running. The buses took you to school. Back in North Utica, we used to walk to school about a mile, all the way up the main drag, walk back. So it was much, much better resourced. But again, privileged in the sense that my father benefited from FHA loans that were available to him because he was a white guy, right? VA benefits that were available to him because he was a white guy. Able to get the types of jobs that he was able to get, partly because he was a white guy. And I don't want to overstate this, but it was in an era, in the post-war era, when if you were a white guy and you were able to work pretty hard, you could support a family, buy a home on a single income, and actually make ends meet and build up equity in your home, right, over the course of years, so that, by the time I was a teenager, my parents had a pretty comfortable life on one income. My mother was a homemaker. She did a lot of volunteer work. She worked her butt off, really, but she had a couple of part-time jobs here and there, but didn't really work outside of the home very much. It was mostly just for a little extra spending money or whatever, in the later years. But she was home most of the time. And it was one income, and they were living relatively comfortably. It was a comfortable home. Again, brought about through the types of advantages you have when you were a white person. My father worked in a company of all white people. He worked with contractors, all of whom were white. The house built in the white suburb of New Hartford was built with the assistance of all of his contractor friends, who, a lot of them donated their labor because, they all worked together. Dad would throw them work, they would bring customers, that sort of thing. It was a kind of a mutual exchange type thing. But again, it's the sort of thing that white people could benefit from, right? Because they have a network and they have the law on their side. And they have the option to live in whatever neighborhood they can afford to buy into. And they have more doors open to them as far as employment goes. So my father, without a high school diploma, just an equivalency diploma, was able to do quite well for himself, relatively speaking, until like the 1980s, when he was coming close to retirement. Then he started having some troubles. But me, I, compared to any person of color living in the city of Utica, my life in New Hartford as a pre-teenager, teenager, it was a charmed life. What run-ins I had with the law were more or less little brushes here and there, but nothing like an arrest, because they weren't really paying attention to people like me. Sometimes we'd have a cat and mouse game with the local cops or whatever, but it was mostly just for entertainment, or a little bit of like teenage melodrama. The sort of thing that could get, a black person killed or thrown into jail or, whatever, beat up just a few miles down the road because of who we were and what we looked like. We got a free pass, right? And I guess what I'm saying is that my opportunities in life, like so many white people of the sort of upper working class, middle class, growing up in the time that I was growing up, I could fuck up and I'd be fine, as long as I didn't fuck up too bad. So, you get a lot of mulligans when you're white. That's all I can say. So, I went through high school and I didn't really have any sort of career focus or any idea what I was going to do when I got out of high school. I had a kind of just because of my orientation, more or less, politically and in terms of just my view of the world, I always felt like, well, the world's probably going to blow up before I do anything for a living, so who cares? So I didn't really, think about what my career was going to be once I left high school. And then I sort of wandered into college and I sort of meandered through basic, courses and programs. I didn't have a major for the first couple of years, and then I dropped out and I actually went to a state school for a while. Then I worked as a musician for about 10 years. And again, that was pretty hand to mouth, but I always had a net under me. So, you're talking about somebody who had every opportunity, even as just the son of a guy who worked at a flooring store, right? A guy who sold paint and flooring and did measurements for, linoleum installs, that sort of thing. I still had plenty of opportunity. I was a good student, but wasn't really very focused. So I could get into a decent college, but I didn't really do anything with it, right? And I didn't need to, because I'm white. Largely. And because of the timing. In part because of the timing. Because I was a boomer and I grew up at a certain time. And it was the option to sort of meander was available to me, right? So, I spent most of my 20s into my 30s. I spent my 20s as a musician on a very low level. Nothing even approaching, the big time, just playing in wedding bands, show bands, party bands, that sort of thing. Some of my own projects, and God knows I worked with my brother a little bit here and there. That's a whole other story, but ended up going back to college, got a degree, and couldn't really do very much with it until I landed a job as a advertising writer. And that was mostly because of an introduction by a family member. Now, it was the type of job where, an introduction gets you so far, right? It may get you in the door, but you have to be able to do the job in order to stay in the room. It's one of those kind of sink or swim situations. It was a small agency, and I managed to turn that into something that resembled a career. But see, the thing is, again, it's because I'm a white dude, right? I have the connections. I have the network of people who sort of go to bat for you. I had parents who were well off enough to be able to catch me if I fell. I had friends and relatives who could speak up for me, and doors were opened for me. Even though I was not an ambitious person, and even though I didn't really work very hard to get to where I was, I managed to land in a relatively comfortable place, and that's mostly a product of the fact that I am a white person. And if I were a person of color, I would not have had the same opportunities. If I were a person of color and I made decisions that would be considered unwise by most, which I definitely did make, I would not be able to recover from those decisions. I would not have had the same network. I wouldn't have had the same set of options. It would have resulted in a lot more hardship. And make no mistake, I had some rough years in terms of trying to scrape together a living, right? But it's not of the same category as most people on the bottom of the income ladder experience as rough times, right? When you're really, worried about being out in the street. I was never at a point where I was worried about being thrown out into the street because I always had a place to go home to. Through my 20s and into my 30s, I had a place to go. I had the support of my family. It's because they had the resources to be able to support me. Because they were white. And because they were middle class. And because they had that foundation and they came up when they came up in the post-war years, when a single wage earner could support a family of 7 relatively easily and have some money left over, right? And so I had opportunities. If I had been an ambitious person, I might have been able to do a lot more with my opportunities. But even as somebody who had zero ambition and zero vision as far as like what I wanted to do for a living, and I'm not ashamed of that, that's fine. It's just not someplace that I wanted to go. But if I had been a tremendously ambitious person or a very career-focused person, yeah, I would have had, doors swinging open for me, I'm sure. But as such, without the ambition, without the sort of career focus, I still landed in a comfortable place because of who and what I am. Not because of any particular effort on my part. Though I did have to work at it a little bit. But seriously, if you're a person of color, you're in a situation similar to what I was in, you could work your butt off and it wouldn't make any goddamn difference. Because those doors would not open for you. They would not open for you. If you don't have the connections, this is a general statement. I'm sure there are individuals for whom something similar would happen that happened with me. But generally speaking, it's less common, far less common for people of color to have the kinds of connections that would help them out in a case like what I had, in a situation like the one that I was facing as a younger person. And that's, look, what's my point? My point is, if you want to understand race in America, part of what you need to understand is what the white experience is, the white working class experience is, and what advantages people like me have that people of color do not have and have not had over the decades in the United States when working people did relatively well. The period from the end of the Great Depression, World War II, through the 1960s and 70s. And with a little bit of carrying on after that, right? So, I don't ordinarily do this, but I wanted to make some recommendations to my white friends out there. If you're a person of color, listening to this, I'm not saying this for your benefit. You don't need this, right? But I'm going to make some suggestions for my white listeners out there, people who maybe are similarly situated to me. There are a lot of books you can read that may help you begin to grasp what black people and people of color in this country have been facing over the last, 300, 400 years in America, but particularly the last 150 years. The ones that I can recommend most heartily, the ones that have really sort of struck me between the eyes over the last few years, were Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow was one of them, which is just an amazing piece of work that goes through the entire legal law enforcement infrastructure that just keeps black people down. It's an amazingly detailed piece of work. I heartily recommend reading that. Okay, so my second recommendation for white people is a book by Douglas A. Blackmon, named Slavery by Another Name. This is about the peonage system that existed between the Civil War and the Second World War in particular. Basically the criminalization of black life and how black people would be arrested and then had their labor sort of leased out by their captors for profit. It's something that's has an analog today. I mean, really, if you look at our prison, our sort of for-profit prison system, and even our sort of publicly owned prison system, you see something very similar. I mean, people's labor is forced. The 13th Amendment says that, prisoners are basically slaves. So they make use of their labor. It's free labor. Anyway, Slavery by Another Name by Douglas A. Blackmon. It is just it's an amazing piece of work, and I heartily recommend that as well. The third, and I will stop with this one, it's a book by Richard Rothstein entitled The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And it tells the story of the legislative and legal architecture that shut black people out of opportunities for housing and basically segregated America through a system of restrictive covenants, denying FHA loans, denying VA loans, denying all the advantages that people like my parents had in choosing a home wherever they wanted to live. This is the story of redlining, and Rothstein goes through it in great detail. It's a really, really interesting work. I heard him interviewed on, I think, Fresh Air and a couple other shows, and just had to read this book, and I wasn't disappointed at all. It's an amazing piece of work. So I recommend those three as kind of like a starting point, just to get some idea of what again, I'm talking to white people. If you want to begin to understand what the story of race in America is, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Douglas Blackmon's Slavery by Another Name, and Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. Those are some very readable, very edifying works that will give you a good starting point. So, white people, go to your library and find those and read them. They're free. You can get it for free. If you can't find it, let me know. I'll lend you my copy. No problem. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I'd like to hear what you have to say. If you're listening to this, that sounds like one of Matt's songs. If you're listening to this, we'll assume I'm dead, that the situation's septic. Goes on from there. Yeah, if you want to put a word in here, go to anchor.fm/strange sound and leave a voicemail. There's a facility for doing that there. You can also contact me via Twitter at Strange Sound Pod. If you go to big-green.net and click on the podcast tab, you'll see the link to the Anchor site. And there are links to like our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, and so on. So I'm easy to get in touch with. By all means, get in touch with me. Let me know what you think. If you take issue with anything that I discuss here, I'd love to hear from you. Seriously, I'm not I'm not trying to pull a fast one. I really would like to know what people think of this. So reach out, contact me. Let's make this a conversation. If you leave me a voicemail, and if it's something that's, not too obscene, I'll play it on the I'll play it on this show and I'll try to respond to it. Thanks for listening. This has been Strange Sound, coming to you on a near weekly basis. And I'm Joe. I'll see you next time. Take care.